Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House in New York and to Capturing Sustainability in the Arctic with photographers and artists Marion Belanger, Clare Benson, and Marek Ranis, all ASF Fellows, and Icelandic author Andri Snær Magnason, whose new novel On Time and Water was released this week on March 23rd by Open Letter Books. With a rapidly changing landscape in the Arctic, hear how issues related to sustainability and climate change in the region have been captured by creative artists in a conversation moderated by Tim Frandy, Assistant Professor of Folklore Studies at Western Kentucky University. Marion Belanger is an artist in residence at the Connecticut Agricultural Experimental Station in New Haven, where she is making a permanent public art installation with collaborator Martha Lewis. She photographs the cultural landscapes, particularly where geology and built environments intersect. She is the author of Rift Fault, her second book, which juxtaposes images from Iceland, where the mid-Atlantic rift defines the eastern edge of the North American continent plate, and images from California along the San Andreas Fault. Marion earned an MFA from the Yale University School of Art and a BFA from the College of Art and Design at Alfred University. Her work is held in numerous collections and she has exhibited internationally. She has received numerous awards, including the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and 2 American Scandinavian Foundation grants. Her ASF grant supported her work in Iceland on the Rift Fault, as well as her current work on sustainability in the Arctic. Clare Benson is an assistant professor in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Connecticut. She is an interdisciplinary artist and photographer who explores themes of family history, tradition, science, and mythology. She received her MFA from the University of Arizona. She received a Fulbright and American Scandinavian Fellowship to work alongside space scientists and indigenous Sami reindeer herders. In 2017, her monograph, The Shepherd's Daughter, was published by Photo Lucia and is a recipient of the Critical Mass Book Award. Benson's work has been featured in exhibitions, screenings, publications across the US and internationally. Andri Snær Magnason, is one of Iceland's most celebrated writers. He won the Icelandic Literary Prize for fiction, children's fiction, and nonfiction. And in 2019, Magnusson co-directed the documentary Dreamland, which is based on his book Dreamland, a self-help manual for a frightened nation. In 2010, Magnusson has received the Karios Prize and presented to outstanding individual in the fields of intercultural understanding. He ran for the president of Iceland in 2016 and came third out of 9 candidates. His new book On Time and Water depicts the realities of climate change and is being released this week by Open Letter Books. Marek Ranis is Associate Professor of Art at the College of Art and Architecture at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and is a multimedia environmentalist artist. Through film and installation, sculpture, photography, painting, and social practice projects, Rannis has been exploring the dramatically changing polar environment, climate migration, and the experiences of the Arctic indigenous communities, as well as growing culturally diverse in the northern regions. His work has been supported by the American Scandinavian Foundation Fellowship. He presented his work in more than 100 individual and group shows nationally and internationally. His work was recognized by the United States State Department. His essay on his Arctic experience was included in the book publication Our Arctic Nation as a voice representing North Carolina. Marek is continuing his work in Alaska and the Arctic in Arctic Norway as an artist and a researcher, and recently named the curator at large at the University Anchorage Museum in Alaska. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce the moderator of today's talk, ASF Fellow Tim Frandy. Born and raised on the Ojibwe lands near Lake Flamblu in Wisconsin, Tim Frandy is a member of the Sami American community and the Assistant Professor of Folklore Studies at Western Connecticut University. Working mostly in Sami and Ojibwe communities, his works involve decolonization, indigenous knowledges, indigenous sustainabilities. He has recently edited and translated a collection of traditional Sami stories from the village of Anar called Inari Sami Folklore, the stories from Anar, the first anthology of Sami stories ever published in English. So please welcome everyone.
Purrisvuahtiin puahkaiden. Mun samenamalla Tuomas et ja mun davis konsenser ja mun halidivchen kutneahti. Anashnabe algot mi Cherokee Yuchi ja Shani almin gen eatnamis mun ormadao. I'd just like to welcome you all. I'm very excited to be here. I'm from the Sami American community, so I would like to recognize the lands of my ancestors in Kemi and Karasavun Sami territories, as well as the indigenous lands upon which I was born and raised in Anishinaabe territories of northern Wisconsin, and the lands I'm currently residing on in western Kentucky that belong to Shawnee, Cherokee, and Yuchi peoples. I'm very excited to step back mostly for this panel today, as I get to talk with other artists about these wonderful artists about their work. And I'd like to really build upon the introductions that Kyle's laid out and just sort of get into discussing the artists' work in their own voice. I've asked all the artists to bring in any work samples they'd like to share and to really just talk about themselves, their artistic vision, particularly as it relates to the theme of their art in relationship to the Arctic, climate change, and sustainability. So with that said, I'd like to turn it over maybe to Marion first to talk for maybe about 5 minutes about your work and where is it from and what do you do with it and how does it connect to the Arctic?
Fabulous. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. There we go. All right, so I think I'll start off a little bit with how I got to Iceland and the Arctic to begin with. Let me just make this large. Okay. So first I want to say welcome, everybody, and thank you, a warm thank you to the American Scandinavian Foundation for hosting this talk and inviting me to be on this panel. It's an important topic. And also thank you for your ongoing support of arts and ideas between the United States and Scandinavia. And I'm especially delighted to be sharing the conversation with the other panelists. I think it's very exciting, come from different disciplines, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. So I wanted to just mention my book, Refault. It was published in 2016 by Radius Books, and it was the result of my kind of my first foray into Iceland and the Arctic. So it's kind of a roundabout story with how I got there. I'm primarily a photographic artist who works along the intersection of geology and the built environment. I was a Guggenheim Fellow in the Florida Everglades, and the Everglades were really kind of, it was a very difficult project because they had been so drained and manipulated by the Army Corps of Engineers to make way for more development in agriculture that essentially 50% of the Everglades were lost. So I photographed inside and outside of the national park boundary, kind of what was preserved in a living museum and what was lost, and the result of that. So anyways, it was a very difficult kind of project because the ecosystem was so compromised, and I think we all know that Florida is having just a horrible time with sea level rise and saltwater intrusion right now. So at the end of that project, I was wondering where might there be a geologic boundary that can't be controlled or contained. And eventually I got to tectonic plates, and I found that I was really interested in tectonic plates because they slide along the fluid mantle of the Earth, underneath our oceans, our land, our homes. They're kind of elusive in a sense because they're larger than the continents. But I became really interested in the idea of photographing the two edges of the North American tectonic plate in Iceland and the San Andreas Fault in California. So the book was structured in a way, so there's a section on the right is rift and the left is fault. And you can open the pages kind of at will. You know, and most of the geologic phenomena like earthquakes and volcanoes happen along the edges and boundaries of plates. So I'm just showing you a few pairs here to give you a sense. At the time, you know, I went specifically because of this geologic boundary. But once I got to Iceland, I mean, who can resist Iceland? It's just like this incredible place. And I wrote down some of the words that let's see. I wrote down some of the words that I thought about in terms of Iceland. It was my first time in Scandinavia, and my impression was clean, pure, uncluttered, practical, ecologically focused, sustainably based. You know, everything from bringing your own bags to the supermarket to using geothermal energy for greenhouses, heat, electricity, and especially the hot pools. You know, it reflected like an amazing kind of creativity to living in that kind of harsh climate. So I photographed all of that. I photographed the edges of the plate. I photographed the hot pools, the geothermal plants, just kind of the empty landscape itself, but all along the rift. In California, I photographed really specifically along the fault. And California is a very different landscape. I mean, so much of the evidence of the edge of the plate is disappeared. You know, it's not dramatic in the same way that Iceland is. So there's something about like the dramatic nature of the photographs of Iceland and the very kind of mundane photographs of California that I liked. You know, it's kind of like, how do you photograph something that's essentially unseen? It's underneath, there's the boundary of the earth, and there's underneath the earth and above where we stand. So I was kind of like chasing this almost, you know, somewhat of an elusive goal. And but as I worked in Iceland, I became just more and more impressed with the idea of sustainability. And I started the project in 2006 when climate change was essentially I mean, you know, the public knew about climate change. We knew the earth was warming, but I don't think it had hit the alarming state that we're in right now. And so it, you know, it wasn't in the news as much. It wasn't as, it didn't seem as urgent. But then, of course, everything accelerated, and it became, you know, really, it's scary. It's you know, one of the issues of our time. And so I wrote another grant to revisit and kind of like focus more specifically on sustainability. And one place that I visited was, there's, I'm gonna read this to you. In 2012, a team of international researchers and engineers began injecting carbon dioxide into porous basalt rock, formed from cooling lava at an underground test site in Southwest Island. The CO2 from the steam is captured and dissolved in large amounts of water. This fizzy water is then pumped into an injection site where chemical reactions convert the CO2 into minerals. Trapped in rock, the CO2 can't leak out of the ground and into the atmosphere. So when they were testing this, they found that 2 years later, almost all of the CO2 had morphed into carbonate minerals and was fixed into rock. This is the facility. And I mean, this looks so kind of you know, like nothing, but it's really, you know, capturing, you know, it's changing the CO2, putting it down into the ground and coming out with this piece of rock where you see the pink line. So, so, you know, there's like, this is very, very new. I'm not sure if they've expanded. I think there's maybe in Switzerland, there's a site that's doing the same thing. But I also went to Kurna, where it was really striking to me that, you know, the whole town is moving because of an underground mine. And, you know, it's kind of, in a way, the opposite side of the coin. But one thing that was really, really interesting, and it happened just by circumstance when I was in Sweden, there was an international conference and practicum for first responders in the Baltic Sea. And it was for the first time ever, climate change was on the roster of emergencies to be training for. You know, extreme weather and other, you know, events that warming climate, floods, were just being handled when I was there. And so I think that might be a good place to end. Thank you very much. Sorry about the technical difficulty.
Not a problem at all. Thank you, Marion.
Okay,
Let's
sure.
move on to Marek.
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks again for the invitation. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. In particular, because I believe in my personal experience with the American Scandinavian Foundation and my grant, which was already many years ago, was quite important and influential in my work. My work since late 80s, beginning of 90s is focusing almost completely on environmental issues. I'm maybe not surprising. I'm coming from Central Europe, which is a pretty devastated part of the world, and continue to be, since we are in Poland, still relying heavily on the coal. But since 2002, which makes almost 20 years, my artistic practice and research is focusing almost completely on climate change. And the fact that the grant I received from American Scandinavian Foundation, I believe in 2007, which allowed me to, at the time, to continue my work, but not only that, actually allowed me to spend some significant time in Greenland and completely kind of reevaluate my research and from my initial intention to focus on historical aspect of the disappearing Norseman colony in Greenland 1,000 years ago, to focus on contemporary times and kind of addressing the issue of climate change and colonialism, which in particular in Greenland is continue to be a major issue. I see my research as a kind of ongoing evolution. My current long-standing relation with Anchorage Museum allows me to kind of continue my education and not only addressing idea of the climate, but also anthropology of the climate change, the indigenous rights, representation of indigenous people in conversation about the Arctic in particular. I'm really pleased to be on the panel with Tim, because maybe my next slideshow or fragment of my film will be something of interest.
Most indigenous people have been affected by borders put by others than themselves. It is a sad fact that those who understand the land, who know the secrets about it, the positive things, the resources, the medicines, the dangers, they are pushed away. And those who take over, they have little, if any, kind of understanding of the land. To them, it seems that the land is an enemy that has to be conquered. So the conquest is devastating, because it has only selfish and egoistic aims that are, in the end, very destructive.
This is a fragment of my 2019 documentary film about Hans Ragnar Mathiesen, who is a Sami artist, printmaker, painter, poet, musician, art critic, art educator, but most important, I believe, indigenous Sami cartographer. He's quite famous for his 1972 map of Sapmi, a land of Sami people, which includes all the nations which are part of the Scandinavia where Sami people live. And I think that I'm using this example of my recent work to kind of also talk a little bit about the fact that I continue to work as a visual artist, multidisciplinary artist in the North and producing my work. But I'm also refocusing my attention to actually people, artists, creatives who are actually living and working in those places. So when we talk about sustainable Arctic or North in general, I think we all have a great tendency to kind of project our ideas, what this is supposed to be and how North is supposed to look and what are the solutions. I actually find that in most cases, our conversations, especially on the East Coast, are about 10 years behind the North itself, because they already talk about climate change for many years. And they, at this point, we are post-climate change. We talk about mitigation methods, we're talking about adaptation methods, not necessarily about recognition of the fact as it is. So my work also as a curator at large for Anchorage Museum allows me to kind of recognize other people who actually live and work there, who not only have a professional interest of those issues, but they have a long tradition of living off the land, living subsistence living, understanding what are the challenges of not only of Alaskan life, but Hans Ragnar lives in Tromsø, Norway. We all know that Norway heavily depends on oil exploration, but at the same time, it's environmentally very, very conscious. So that's what we kind of can talk as an Arctic paradox. On some level, Iceland is kind of a good example of that. Arctic is dramatically changing. It's not the place we kind of imagine. It's a global place with an extremely diverse group of people. Actually, Anchorage, Alaska school district is actually equally diverse as New York City. Places like Tromsø, it's probably about 40 different languages spoken in the Arctic. We are, because of the US GDP, it's really small from the Arctic in comparison to Russia or Norway. We are pretty much very much removed from those issues. We have little understanding and knowledge. We think about Arctic like a Mars, almost like an alien place, but it's extremely contemporary, global, and I think kind of much more advanced in terms of thinking about what is the future of the globe than we are, especially I am in the South, I'm in the North Carolina. So I'm going to share one more project which relates to this issue and maybe kind of be more with some humor. Excuse me. In recognition of this diversity in the Arctic, I work on the project which is focusing on the cultural diversity of the North, and my inspiration from Anchorage, Alaska in particular, to focus on this and use the language as a subject led me to multiple projects, and one of the last one is this one, which is a book which, in collaboration with Anchorage Museum, we're able to publish last year. It's called Little Red Riding Hood, New Translation. So this book is placing Little Red Riding Hood in Alaska, and the story we all know and very familiar. It's told through multiple languages with using untranslatable words from many languages of people who live in the North. So the story is pretty much told through lexicon of the words, which mostly describe a positive emotions, which on some level relate to the story. I also produce a social card game. We were able also to produce ballet choreography, focusing on this phenomenon of untranslatable words. But I just want to stress the fact that our perception in most cases about the North as a very remote and empty place, it's most of the time not really true.
All right, thank you, Mark. That was fascinating. To keep things moving along, let's just go to Claire.
Great, thank you. I just want to start by thanking you all for being here, and for those that might be watching this later, and thanks to Tim and for the other panelists for the work that you've done, to ASF for organizing the event and continuing to support our ideas, and to all the others who I've worked with, the Swedish Fulbright Commission and the people from IRF and from the Sami community that allowed the work to happen. It's an honor to be here and to share in this conversation with you all. So I'm going to share my screen and show some of the work that I've done. So I began working in the Arctic in 2014 as a Fulbright Fellow, and I returned in 2016 with the support of an award from the American Scandinavian Foundation. I was based in Kiruna in Sweden, approximately 145 kilometers or 90 miles north of the Arctic Circle line. I'm going to share a cross-section of the work that I began there, which has 3 different parts that are all connected, but somewhat intricately threaded together. And so I hope I can try to keep you with me on this little journey. I was hosted by the Swedish Institute of Space Physics, also known as IRF, where I worked alongside space scientists, alerting their research into solar storms and northern lights, moons of other planets, and comets that traveled within our reach. During this time, I also worked with a number of people from the indigenous Sami community, those who were reindeer herders, artists, storytellers, and healers. The Sami are known to have descended from the sun, and their constellations tell the story of an incredible reindeer hunt. I was drawn to this place where these 2 communities maintain a strong presence, and I was interested in the ways that time could be collapsed in a place, merging past and future, and science and ancient myth. I understood as well the very fragile nature of time in this Arctic landscape. Soon after I'd arrived in the fall, I learned that we would lose 8 minutes of sun each day until there was no sun left to lose. These images are part of a series called Until There Is No Sun, these last 2 images. I became very interested in this idea of the changing light and the sky and the worlds that merge and overlap. I began working with the images from an all-sky camera that looked up out the roof of the Space Institute and made an image every minute of every night, and only at night. Because of the extreme wide angle of the lens, the camera is able to see the whole sky, and it creates a circular image. I created time-lapse videos from the images to understand how the night moves, and though we were looking up at the sky, at times it appears to be an Earth spinning and then something else. This was a night when the aurora were particularly strong. In this work, I consider notions of seeing and perception. The camera itself appeared to be an eye looking out the window through the roof of the building, and the image it makes of a cloud-covered sky appears like another planet or an anatomical drawing of the human eye. I collect old scientific illustrations, maps of bodies and outer space, as we tried to understand them long ago. And I refer back to these in effort to comprehend that time itself is a measuring device, that time transcends understanding, and with time, even science can become legend and ancient myth. One of the last branches of my work that I want to highlight is work that I began doing with a scientist who studies the eyes of Arctic reindeer. I worked with him to photograph his findings that the physical structures within their eyes actually change from summer to winter, allowing them to see more or less light in such drastically changing conditions. In the winter, the reflections of the TL, the tapetum lucidum, behind their retina, which is what we see here, it reflects light that is a deep blue, and in summer, it shifts to be a bright golden yellow. This is an example of a reindeer that was slaughtered in the spring. And so we see the shift beginning to occur from blue to yellow. The images of these structures become a kind of body map of where the earth was in relation to the sun, based on the last light that the reindeer saw. They even mimic the colors and the light we see in images of celestial bodies. Though all of these different parts of my work in the Arctic, or through all of these different parts of my work in the Arctic, there are broader metaphors of time and change in the body and in the landscape. It is a continued reminder of the relationship between the earth and the sun, and of the continuing changes that we see and don't see. And that's that's my sharing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. And the last up is Andri.
Hello, can you hear me now? Okay.
We'll go
So
with that,
my
yes.
name is Andri Snær Magnason. I'm talking from Iceland. And I am a writer, sometimes filmmaker. You could say accidental filmmaker. I did a documentary film from my book Dreamland, and unintentionally, that is, I was kind of helping out, but I ended up co-directing it. And then I made a film that is premiering now in Copenhagen, called The Hero's Journey to the Third Pole, a bipolar musical documentary with elephants, and following two bipolar Icelanders to a mental health awareness concert in Kathmandu. And so it's kind of about mental health awareness, but my book On Time and Water came out in America yesterday, and it is coming out in 30 languages currently. So it's coming out in, it's out in Poland, and it's out in Scandinavia, and yeah, all over. I'm not going to count it all. And maybe I could try sharing the screen. I'm not so good at, oops, sharing the screen here. So On Time and Water is trying to understand what it means to live in times when nature has left geological speed and has started to change on a human level. That is, forces that used to take 1,000 years or 10,000 years are possibly happening on a single lifetime. And how actually the issue is so large that you could say it's larger than language. It's larger than most metaphors that we have. It's larger than our previous experiences, and how to talk about these issues when you maybe don't even have a language to talk about them. So, so my book, the metaphor that I use for the book is the black hole. That is, a black hole is so dense that you can't really look straight into it. The only way to understand the black hole is by looking around it, to the periphery, how it's pulling in neighboring stars and galaxies. And the only way to understand this issue is in my book is, or the method that I use in my book is not to look straight into it, but to look around it. To look at the past, the future, to look at, to understand the future, I look at the past. To understand science, I use mythology. To understand global issues, I write about family. So, so my book is kind of a tribute to storytelling. I'm talking about my grandparents that were the first generation to actually encounter and discover the Icelandic glaciers. They were founding partners of the Icelandic Glacial Research Society when the glaciers seemed eternal. But now, within somebody, before somebody is born today, reaches the age of my grandmother, many of the greatest glaciers in Iceland will be gone. And the idea is that history is about ideas. History is about empires, politics, kings, queens, wars. But mythology is about creation stories and creation myths and end myths. And the idea is that that our times are in a way mythological, because we're shaking the foundations. We're not just shaking the ideas. We're not just believing in different gods or belonging to different kingdoms. We are altering the foundations of everything. So, for example, words like ocean acidification. The idea is that such a word, the word ocean acidification, is a completely different word than humanity has ever been faced with. It's a very new word, and the word was only coined in English around 2003. It only appeared in Iceland in 2006. It was mentioned once. It was mentioned once in 2007. It was never mentioned 2008, and it was twice mentioned 2009. So ocean acidification is about the fact that the pH of the world's oceans is changing in the next 80 years, more than in the previous 50 million years. The change is so great that you can taste the difference. And the problem is that 50 million years are just enormous for us, while 0.3 in pH on a logarithmic scale is something that we have no metaphor to understand what 0.3 in pH is. And how can you understand that this graph is about the greatest geological explosion that has happened on our planet in 50 million years? And what language, and why, when we see a graph like this, because it could basically alter all marine life on the planet, why does this not have direct effect on policy, on business, on our actions? Why do we keep on living the way we're living after we have seen this? So my book is, in a way, also about how long it can take to understand an issue, how long it can take to understand a word. So I go back to mythology. I go back to when Icelanders became Christian, and we had to adopt new words like sin, or mercy, or heaven, and all these kind of concepts that came with Christianity. I go back to democracy, when Icelanders were offered democracy in 2009, in 1809, but we didn't understand it because the French Revolution had not been translated to Icelandic. So I'm going kind of into mythology, into poetry, into science, into family history, and weaving together kind of a narrative thread, trying to understand what it means to be living in times when the basic fundamental entities like glaciers are basically vanishing in front of our eyes. And what this means in terms of language, in terms of paradigms that we have, that the 20th century gave to us, and we are still living in, even after we have seen the dramatic changes that are happening. So On Time and Water is about glaciers, grandmothers, holy cows, crocodiles. Maybe this sounds a bit chaotic, but it all makes sense within the narrative arts that I'm trying to create in the book.
Wonderful, thank you so much. That's
I hope
such fascinating work. I had one question for all of you before we'll be moving into the Q&A section momentarily. I invite any audience members to post any questions in the chat for you. But I had one first that I wanted to ask about the futures, or like imagining Arctic futures. We see that there are problems, we recognize them, but what sort of vision do you see as being the future of the Arctic? And what sort of roles does your art play in sort of achieving that vision? We'll go in the same order and just get everyone's brief comments because we're a little short on time. So Marion. Oh, you're muted. Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
I got it. I'm not sure if I have one specific answer for that. You know, I do I mean, everything is changing, and you know, trees are going to be growing, plants are going to be growing that weren't there before. Passages are going to open up, you know, in the ocean, and ships are going to go through. I don't know. I mean, I do think it's kind of overwhelming how quickly things are changing. But I don't know. I think that there are lessons about sustainability to be learned for the rest of us. But at the same time, I think there's going to have to be some adaptation in terms of you know, species and how and ecosystems. So,
Marion?
Well, Tim, I mean, this is like a huge subject. I can maybe touch on a couple aspects. One which directly relates to climate, which is people migration. I think that we're already facing internal migration in Alaska and many other places as a result of erosion of the coastal line. This is all we know about it, but also we are much more aware, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, about people migration from the south to the north. This trend will continue. I think that many people recognize the north as a place where people were, not only because of economical opportunities, but definitely because of the climate, people will migrate. That creates tremendous challenges, but also opportunities. In the same time, dependency on the oil in the Arctic will be a major issue, since still there is plenty of carbon energy there to be mined and to be explored. How can we kind of diversify it and try to run away from this, so kind of find different way of economical development? I think that Scandinavia in particular is kind of leading this direction. I think that culturally, like I mentioned, Arctic become much more diverse, and that creates, I think, tremendous interesting opportunities. And I think in a sense, we can look kind of more bright in the future. So I can continue, but probably I want to leave some other topics to be explored by my colleagues. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. Claire.
Yeah, it's a really complicated question, or complicated set of questions. I think that with what Marion was saying about just how complicated it is, that landscape is changing, and much of that will be out of our control. The pace at which it's happening is something I think we can hope to slow, but when animals are going extinct, species are going extinct, and of plants and animals, and life is thriving in parts of the world that never has before. It's, you know, it's just changing, and I think our ability to adapt to that and try to work with that and be flexible and understanding that it's shifting and how can we work with it. I don't know how we do that exactly, but I think this idea of like conservation and preservation can get really sticky when we try to just keep things exactly as they've been. And I think as artists, it's super important that we're continuing to think about these ideas and express them. I think that as artists, we speak a language that has the power to move people. And so I hope that it can help to open people's eyes and make them think about these places differently and make them understand part of what's happening.
Yeah, very well said. Andri, do you have thoughts on this point?
Well, it's a huge question, and can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. So it's a huge question, and the Arctic is so diverse. It's so different. Even just Iceland and Greenland are so different, and so I think many people are, while maybe species and like Iceland is very depending on, you know, what happens to ocean acidification, what, you know, how is marine life reacting to global warming. Our topsoil, our vegetation is benefiting from global warming, unless the Gulf Stream moves. And as a society, we're also relying on the glaciers of the Himalayas, because if the Himalayan glaciers melt, and we see mass movement from that area, or mass disruption in the political systems, then that affects the domino effect will affect our lives, and so it's almost impossible to predict a scenario, and what kind of but I think that you could say that global warming and just meeting zero emissions and getting some control over the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is maybe a megalomaniac. Well, humans created the problem, so they must in some way be able to get their hands over it. So I think that that issue is so vital that all the other issues, marginalization, that is all other issues in the Arctic are kind of based on if we manage this, the permafrost, the oil exploration, the ocean acidification. It's just all based on what policies will be on top. And you can be kind of astonished with this. I like this idea of the paradox, because Icelanders, until very recently, we really wanted to find oil. We wanted to be Norway, and Greenland wanted to find oil. Everybody dreamed of finding oil, which would then undermine the whole existence of the ecosystem of your living. But you could maybe buy yourself some kind of security. So yeah, it's a difficult question.
Yeah, it's wonderful answers. There's such an important role, I think, with all of the work that you're doing in terms of wrestling with some of these issues and bringing them up, and creating an understanding for people who are not from the Arctic. I mean, a lot of the environmental issues from an indigenous perspective are absolutely terrifying, because they justify the opening of colonization of indigenous lands in the Arctic. It's very, very daunting, and which is something that I've seldom heard anyone argue for. There's a question in the chat from Marek. When will your documentary on Hans Ragnar Mathiasen be released, and how can it be seen? And please feel free to post more questions in the chat.
Actually, the film was premiered in 2019 at the Nordic Art Museum in Tromsø already, and I was able to show in other places in Norway. I'm trying to show it in other festivals, so a couple places got canceled because of the COVID. So I'm hoping to continue showing the film. It's available. I mean, if somebody will ask me, I can send the link to Vimeo and send the link for a private viewing. Other than that, it's most of the time shown in the museum and galleries. Thanks for the interest.
So I might ask another question about your, when you're working in the Arctic, if you're not from the Arctic in particular, you tend to have experiences that sort of shape your perceptions, your attitudes, your understandings of climate change and its impacts in ways that are very personal and powerful. Have any of you had any of these direct sort of moving experiences from the time that you've spent working in the field?
I can maybe start. I have a kind of profound experience when I was invited to Anchorage Museum as an artist in residence, and I went there to actually work on the documentary film, which was focusing on impact of climate on the indigenous community. And thanks to the museum, I was able to actually have access to interview a lot of people from indigenous community, travel all over Alaska, produce a lot of interviews. And big experience was for me at the time that I was actually interviewing a lot of people who were already experiencing tremendous kind of amount of media fatigue. They were interviewed many times. They were talking about on this to too many documentary crews. I realized that for me, I would be able to still produce documentary film, but on the same time, I was feeling like I'm not, which might be interesting in the South, but I'm not going to actually bring any new information, any new ideas to Alaskans themselves. So actually, I dropped this project. I produced the material. I never edited, and I think it was very you know, make me really feel very modest and kind of let me understand that my understanding and my perception is so limited, and I need to kind of refocus my attention from projecting my ideas on the place, but focusing more on people who actually have something to say, maybe themselves, not necessarily me become kind of an ambassador to Arctic or to Alaska. And that's that was a very profound experience for me, which I still kind of, I keep in my mind all the time.
I can respond a little as well. And I might be sort of dancing around the question because I don't know that there were any, I mean, the experience of like hiking or seeing glaciers that are no longer the glaciers that we once knew is pretty powerful, and thinking about how that's changing. And I have sort of an anecdote that is related but unrelated. I think a lot in all of these metaphors that speak to the change and the impact that we as humans have on the earth. And so one of the things I know Marion mentioned, that in Kiruna, they moved the town, or they're in the process of moving the town over many years because so that they can continue the underground mining that they're doing that goes underneath the old town. And I actually photographed some of these instruments that lined the perimeter of the mine that are sort of interesting to see, and especially when you're there to see them, but they're reflecting, they're like mirrors that point up to the sky, and they measure the distance or the level of the ground based on communicating with or measuring from satellites, so that you actually have a measurement of whether or not the earth is sinking in those areas around the mine. And so that for me to see those was this really sort of ominous thing that spoke to this idea of change and warning that could happen, that we may face, and thinking about Marion's image too of the first responders, and that we're actually starting to think about how do we respond in an emergency. And I think a big question for me, especially when we're living in this time where we're responding to a crisis and having to do that, and it's not always a easy thing or a smooth thing, and just thinking about the challenge that is the long-term way that climate change works, where we're seeing these, and it's sort of indirect, the effects that we're seeing, these major natural disasters and things that I think many could say are not necessarily related, but that are pretty related. So I think it's hard to point out to one thing, but I think about it with all of these things that are happening, and I hope that other people can do that as well. And in the Arctic especially, to just understand that it is this really fragile space where that change is going to be seen. It's going to continue to be seen much faster than in other places.
I'd like to just follow up with that. A comment about Kiruna, when I think it underscores the complexity, because I mean the mine, the town was essentially a mining town. It's in its newest incarnation, right? But people who work in the mine chose to move their town, move their houses, or sell their house and move into a different house for economic reasons. And I think that this is really the complex issue with all of this. It's like the interests of economic interests versus ecological health, and there's just no easy answer there. I mean, even in Iceland, certain species of fish are becoming, fished out, or, they're becoming extinct or migrating. So, this is all, and fishing is so important to the economy there. So I think that, it's like really complicated to tease this all out. I don't even remember what the original question was, but that's just what I wanted to say about it.
That's okay. Andri, would you like a chance to respond to anything here? You're muted too.
If I pick up on the Kiruna issue, then often kind of the Arctic and the Nordic have wanted to be like, have this image of the noble savage, like the people that know nature and understand it. But in Iceland, we went through this crazy period, like from 2000 to 2010 or something, when we were showing that we were willing to sacrifice almost anything in nature for an economic gain. And often it was the locals that knew best their local environment. If they felt underprivileged in some way or insecure of their income, they would be ready to sacrifice basically anything for a house and a car or some imaginable economic income. So these areas were very vulnerable for kind of people with a shiny PowerPoint presentation promising an extension of the town and a big sports hall and lots of jobs. And so Iceland, despite being so close to nature, and that's how I started to think, like that everywhere where nature is being spoiled, there is somebody living close to that nature. And it's not always colonized people. It's often the people that actually know that nature the best, that are not, and sometimes pretend to be in close contact. And just like Greenlanders, they were crazy for aluminum, oil exploration, all these things, just like Icelanders. And that made me kind of think a lot about this, projection that we have against, people living close to things, that they were in some kind of balance or harmony. But it seems like I don't really have an answer to this question, but you can't, maybe for the American viewers or something, don't totally fall for the noble savage of the Arctic, because we are like, people in Montana or anywhere around the world that have been willing to sell off vital resources that are even on a global scale important, just for a very small marginal income, or a very small town could sell off, huge resources.
So there are two. We're about at time, but we started a couple minutes late, and I would like to get a little bit more discussion out of you, if that's okay. There were two wonderful questions posed in the chat, and one is another big question. Can you speak about how your work addresses the moral dilemma that climate change poses? And the second is, what aspect of climate change are you hoping to affect with your specific works? Is there a hierarchy of needs or changes that you can share? I'd like to invite all of our panelists to speak on one of those two questions as we sort of pull the threads together. And also, before every one of our audience members leaves, I'd invite you to, in your spare time, drop any links of your own personal websites or works that you'd like to promote in the chat, so people can find your art after we're done with this session.
I can maybe start, because my computer is dying, and I don't have the power exchange. So I say hello to Judy Natal, I know her, and I'm answering her big question about the moral dilemma. So I'm actually writing about that in my book, in Time and Water, is that we are oil. We can't deny that, all our welfare, our existence, just basically everything that we are, everything we can touch, all our reality is based on the benefits of fossil fuels that came from the 20th century. So all this fire, all this burning, all this progress came through the superpowers that was given to us through fossil fuels. And I calculated in my book that, we don't see the fire anymore. We see volcanoes, and we think nature is huge compared to us. But in 2010, we had the Eyjafjallajökull volcano. One had about 150,000 tons per day of emissions. human emissions are about 100 million tons per day. That's like 666 Eyjafjallajökull volcanoes erupting day and night all year, decade after decade. And if you talk to a geologist, then he can point at any period in Earth history where we had 666 volcanoes erupting for 50 years or something. So the moral dilemma is a total dilemma. That is, the superpowers that were given to us, we're addicted to them. They gave us our prosperity, and we need to race as hell to keep these, because we can't be without energy. Energy is what has enabled us to live our lives, and we just have to race as hell to replace fossil fuels with other energy sources. But it's difficult to slut shame people that we're just all in this dilemma together. We're all hypocrites on a different level. But of course, the Nordic nations and maybe the nations that gained first from oil, they should be the first to get out of oil, and that should be like our moral obligation. But then again, the sooner that we get out of oil, the sooner we will develop technologies that will enable people that are rising out of direct poverty to get into to skip that oil or coal part. So that's how I see the dilemma.
Thank you, Andri. We'll hope your laptop lasts long enough to finish the session. Would anyone like to follow that?
I can follow. I think that, I mean, I don't see myself necessarily as an activist. I think that one interesting aspect for me is the understanding that the Earth will survive. The Earth will evolve. The oceans were acidic before, and they will be acidic again. There will be new species, or there will be no life, and then life will come. The problem is, and I actually do subscribe to Black environmentalists, I think the problem is that we will not survive. So I think that the moment we start, I think we need to shift conversation from romanticizing the nature and talk about the species to talk about us. Because it's actually, in the end, a human story, a human civilization story. So when we start looking at the Earth through more geological time, not human time, then we have a better understanding where we're going and what is the risk. I think, the people talking about ignoring those things, people are perfectly capable of being ignorant when their life depends on it. And that's what's happening right now in terms of people's idea about economical gain. They will gain or lose because of the climate issue. So changing this perspective is very difficult. I made the documentary film thinking about maybe approaching the idea of climate through religious belief, and I asked religious people, I mean, from Christian perspective, Hindu, Buddhism, and Muslim, about, is it a sin to pollute? And they all agree to, is it sin? But this argument was kind of well deflected by one of the Muslims in the film, who said, in the Middle East, when you actually talk about environmental issues and people on a daily basis struggling with war or just plain survival, it's extremely difficult for them to even address those topics. Not without reason, we are focusing on the northern part of the world, with pretty wealthy part of the world, when we can actually enjoy this kind of conversation. In the same time, we can look at other parts of the world which people pretty much struggling to survive. But I think that, again, it's all about our survival, and it's not about the polar bear floating on the floating ice, which it is important, but we need to kind of start talking in different terms, not romantic terms. That's my point.
Thank you. Claire or Marion? Marion?
I'd like to just say something. We can get really paralyzed thinking about those questions. But I think that everything we can do in terms of living our life, and I think many of us are teachers, teaching, I remember when I was little, people would litter all the time. And so it became, I remember in school, there was this kind of saying, don't litter, and there were posters and little chants, and, and then it became law. And, I mean, then I lived along a very toxic river before the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. So I think that, the time is a little more compressed now. I mean, there's such an urgency, but I think that, we have to teach in our teachings, we have to model. If we raise kids, they have to, be raised in a certain way where they're aware of these issues. And we have to elect more women to office that have, and to heads of corporations where decisions are being made. So I think there are lots of ways that we can just live our lives and make our art that kind of embrace the complexity of our, contemporary lives. So.
Yeah, I'll speak a little to follow that. I think that I don't know that my work actually really addresses the moral dilemma of climate changes, but I do think that there are a lot of moral dilemmas, and I think that being sensitive to some of these questions and really being kind of thoughtful about how we address them and how we respond to them is important, because we're living in a time when everyone is hyper sensitive about morals and beliefs, and so I mean, I don't think that we should soften our ideas or opinions to sort of pacify that, but I do think that it requires a lot of work to find language that people can hear and that that can bring change. So, and I think that all the things that the others have mentioned are super valuable. Just thinking about some of the big change that needs to happen and how we can support research and activism that's doing what we understand is important, and really stand behind that and help that move forward. But also some of the small decisions of thinking about how much meat we consume, and maybe thinking about less, or where we get that from, and the things that we're teaching our children or our youth, practices in our everyday lives that might seem like small inconveniences, but we're learning very much right now what inconveniences feel like. And I think starting to adapt our lives to be a little bit less less consumptive, or consuming less, and trying to bring that change. But I'm sort of optimistic that if there could be a ripple effect, if enough people really made some changes.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much more we could talk about, but we are at and beyond time. So with that, I'd like to be sure to thank our panelists who for their wonderful insights into this really important topic, and into sharing some of their art with us all. I'd like to thank the American Scandinavian Foundation for organizing this event, and of course, all of the attendees who stuck it out with us today. 15 minutes past the end. We love you very much. Kyle, is there anything you'd like to add to wrap this up?
No, I just would like to say thank you to everyone involved, the panelists, the attendees, you, Tim. I am going to pitch the Foundation's Fellowship and Grants Program. The American Scandinavian Foundation's Fellowship and Grants Program demonstrates the Foundation's longstanding commitment to educational and cultural exchange. For over 100 years, the ASF has given over 7,500 fellowships and grants to Americans engaged in study, research, or creative arts projects in the Nordic country, and to residents of the Nordic countries to pursue their work in the US. In 2020, 69 students, professional and artists were awarded just less than $800,000 in support. But we also are continuing with these panel discussions. We are working on an Indigenous peoples panel for the end of March. And we have a lot of other interesting programs coming up at Scandinavia House. So I do encourage everyone to check out the website or sign up for our weekly newsletter. And again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you everyone for participating. It was a wonderful and insightful conversation. Okay. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.